Welcome everyone to Exploring Quality in Family Child Care Background Noise. I am very excited to introduce our guest presenter today, Dr. Rochelle Newman from the University of Maryland. So I will pass it over to her.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. First of all, I am happy to take questions at any time. So if there is anything I say that isn't clear, please feel free to interrupt, to ask a question, or to put a question in the chat. So today we're going to be talking about background noise. And background noise is just part of modern society. And it has varied and far-reaching effects. So the sounds of airplanes, of traffic, of crowds can be found in most urban public settings. And houses routinely include noise from HVAC systems, from appliances, from televisions. And all of this noise can have a wide range of effects on people. So first of all, it can cause stress and mental health issues. So for example, teachers and students report that noise in schools causes frustration. Teachers are particularly susceptible to vocal strain and to chronic hoarseness from having to raise their voices to be heard over the noise. And I bet some of you probably experience the same problem, finding yourself chronically hoarse from trying to talk over the sounds of lots of children. Stress from noise can contribute to headaches, to ulcers, to heart problems. And noise can also cause hearing loss. And hearing loss, in turn, can lead to social isolation, to depression, and it can also exacerbate effects of dementia. So noise can have lots of different effects on people in general. And it can have effects on children as well. So for school-age children, noise can impact learning in the classroom. In fact, studies that have looked at schools that are located near train tracks. So in New York City, there are some schools that are located right near the tracks. And they've demonstrated clear differences in academic performance for students at the same school if their classroom happens to be on the noisier side of the building than the quieter side of the building. That is, if their classroom happens just randomly to be on the side near the train tracks, those children have noticeable decrements in their academics, and to the extent of being about a grade level different by the end of a year. Likewise, there are some studies that have looked at schools in Europe where flight paths changed from an airport, such that schools that had been underneath a flight path now weren't, or vice versa. And they found clear changes in academic performance immediately after versus before that change in the flight paths. So changes that are too quick to be the result of local neighborhood makeup, or what kids go to that school, what school chooses, how the school is set up, just from those changes in where the airplane flight paths are located. Some schools are simply noisier than others, and children who attend noisy schools have poorer academic outcomes. Not only poorer outcomes overall, but it even changes how they learn. So children who go to noisier schools not only are more likely to fail at tasks, but they are less persistent at a task that's challenging. This has been talked about as a form of learned helplessness. That is, what they learn to do is to give up rather than to be as persistent. And children who are chronically exposed to noise show poorer reading and poorer attention. Now, all of that is from children's studies, from studies of children once they enter schools. But it isn't just an outcome once they get to school. Studies that have measured noise in the home find that infants from higher noise homes show poorer attention skills, and they are more reactive to stressors. So children from noisier environments tend to be more easily stressed by things that aren't as stressful to other children. And they tend to have higher blood pressure, even as infants and toddlers. So noise and noisy environments can have an impact on children's cognitive and emotional development more generally, such that they become less resilient. And we talk about resilience a lot when we talk about how children learn and how successful they likely are to be later in their life. Now, much of that has to do with constant loud noise or consistent loud noise, such as you might find if you live near train tracks or near an airport. And certainly many people experience that kind of noise. But what many people don't realize is that it isn't only those types of consistent loud noises that can cause problems for children. So much of the research that I do has focused on the impact of less extreme forms of noise that is lesser, but maybe more common, such as the sound just of having the radio on in the background in your house or in the childcare setting, or having the TV playing in the other room, or just even having people talking in the next door room. Likewise, the sounds of music from electronic toys or from bouncy seats that children may be in, or from cribs or activity boards that you might have next to a child. Even for many of us who believe we have relatively quiet homes or that we have relatively quiet childcare settings, these types of noises may still be very common. And one of the things that we found is that children may be particularly impacted by levels of noise that really would hardly be noticed by adults and that don't seem to bother us as adults. I should note that I'm going to use the term noise to refer to any sound that is unwanted or isn't the intended focus of attention. So if you're trying to listen to me and there is somebody else talking in the background where you are, I'm going to refer to that as being part of the noise. If it's not what you're trying to pay attention to, I'm going to refer to it as noise, even if someone else might be trying to pay attention to that. So it might be noise for you, but not be noise for someone else. So when we're talking about noise in the home, in the school, in the childcare setting, what we're talking about is anything that a child can hear that isn't what they're trying to hear at that moment. And I'm going to talk about 3 ways that noise can impact young children, focusing on studies that we've done in my lab, but that specifically look at the impact of noise on infants and toddlers, more so than on older school-age children. So I've already said that noise can cause stress, can cause mental health issues, can cause voice issues, but really I'm going to focus today on how noise can interfere with your ability to understand what's being said to you, how it can distract your attention away from what you're trying to pay attention to, and how it can prevent you from learning or retaining information from what you're trying to listen to. So problems with hearing what is said, attending to what is said, or processing or learning from what is said. And I'm going to talk about those three things pretty much in that order. So we're going to start with hearing and understanding. So starting with that first point, one of the things that we do to test children's ability to understand is we compare how they respond when we do something really, really simple, like call their name. So children know their name really early on. 2 to 3 months of age, they're responding to their name. And clearly, when there's no noise at all, we can see children's response. They'll turn their head, they will pay more attention, they'll raise their eyebrows. And this isn't just because they hear us making a call, because they will distinguish between their name and some other children's name said the same way. So in a childcare setting where you might have many different children, if you call one child's name, other children may also look, but children will look differently when it's their name than if it's somebody else's name. When there's tons of noise in the background, clearly children can't do that anymore. But that's really the exception. What I'm interested in, and what I hope I'll make you interested in, is what they do when there's not huge amounts of noise, but just a small amount of noise or a moderate amount of noise, a more typical amount, not just the extremes. And what we find out when we do studies that look at this is that it really doesn't take a lot of noise before infants and children start to fail at this task, when they no longer can distinguish their name from somebody else's name. So what do I mean by not a lot of noise? I'm going to play you the sound of someone calling a child's name in the presence of background noise. And I just want you to try and make out what the name is.
Allison, 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 Allison.
So that probably wasn't too hard. I'm going to guess that all of you could at least tell what name that was. Well, in fact, that level of noise was taken to be an example from what is typically found during story time at a particular child care center. So that level of people talking in the background was the level of noise measured during story time at a child care center. Now, story time should, in theory, be a relatively quiet time. There'll still be noise, but it's the time when, if you're reading a book to children, you expect that they should be able to hear you. There shouldn't be lots of other things going on. But in fact, young children fail to recognize their name at that level of noise. So while most of you could probably hear that the name was Allison, an actual child named Allison was in our study, and children at that level of noise no longer could tell when it was their name being said versus another name. And like I said, that was taken to be a model of what the noise level has been measured at during story time in typical childcare settings. So not even during the loudest times, during free play or during when children are playing together, rather at a time that was supposedly somewhat quiet. I have no idea whether you guys think that this is a comparable level of noise to your childcare settings. I don't know how typical the setting that we measured that in is. Hopefully, though, you can see that it's at least somewhat a realistic level of what noise might be like. And that level of noise is problematic for young children. Now, it depends upon the age of the child. Children get progressively better at listening in noise as they get a little bit older. So if you have older children, because compared to younger children, they might be able to handle that. But even for toddlers aged 2 or 3 years, this seems to be at about the level that's kind of on the edge of what they can handle. Now, there's another way that we will also test children's understanding in noise. And that's by seeing when they no longer can tell the difference between other words, not just their name. So imagine you tell a child to go get their coat. You would want them to hear not just that you said something, but what specifically you said. And so they should get their coat and they shouldn't come back with their shoes instead. So in our lab studies, we will see if they can understand the difference between two known words when there's background noise. We don't actually make children go and get things in our studies, but we see if they look at the right thing. So a child might be shown a picture like this, and we'll say something like, look at the blocks, or look at the keys. And we assume that if they can tell what's being said, despite the noise, they should look longer at whichever is the right answer. They might spend a little time looking at both because they're kind of interesting, but they should respond to our request by looking longer. And what we find is that even in relatively low levels of noise, such as a single person talking on the phone in the background, or just the TV playing in the background, 2- and 3-year-olds start failing at this task. They start not being able to look appropriately at the right picture. And they do so at levels of noise that adults don't think are problematic at all. So if you have the TV on in the background, you might be able to completely ignore that TV and not even to think that it's a problem. It may barely register as noise to you, but for younger children, it can still pose a problem. That is, they can have difficulty understanding speech at levels of noise that don't seem noisy to us as adults. So that's the first way that noise affects children. It can prevent them from understanding things that are said to them, or from even hearing that things were said to them in particular. But children aren't just bad at hearing a noise. They also tend to get distracted quite easily by other sounds. So I'm going to play you another sound, and I just want you to listen to it. So that sound was the sound from a Fisher-Price bouncy seat, one that we actually just recorded. We don't have it very loud, but as you could hear, it's a really fun sound. It has all of that music. It has elephants and animals squealing and making noise.
Rochelle, I hate to interrupt you. I couldn't hear it.
You couldn't hear that one
I
at
could
all.
not.
Oh no.
I think everyone understands they can hear the sound in their head from your explanation of it. A noisy, bouncy seat.
Okay, sorry about that. So the point being that it's a really, really fun sound. It has music, it has animals playing, it has squawks and roars and monkeys chittering and all of these things going on. And even when that sound is really, really quiet, children have trouble paying attention to anything else when that sound is playing. So a lot of the toys that we have for children that are electronic toys have these kinds of really enticing sounds to them. And children have a really hard time disengaging their attention from those kinds of sounds. Now, that particular sound was an exception. It was really especially designed to be fun and enticing. But what we find is that children, young children, not only have trouble with sounds that are softer than adults would, but they simply have trouble choosing to pay attention to one thing versus another. So one thing that makes us as adults able to live and work in noisy environments is that we can choose to direct our attention to different things. So let's say you're trying to listen to me, and there is somebody else talking in the background right now. Now, if that other person talking in the background is, say, male as compared to my voice, that will make it easier for you to pay attention to my voice than if that other voice was another female. And that's because you can use your ability to pay attention selectively to choose what you pay attention to. And as long as the voices are different in some way, that's going to make it easier. So if the voice is a man versus my voice, it'll be easier to tell apart than if it's a female. Or if the noise is coming from a different direction, so you're hearing me through your computer or your phone, but the sound of the noise is coming from another room, you can very easily choose to direct your attention in one direction or to one voice or to one sound. But children are actually really bad at that. So children actually don't selectively attend, so that sounds coming from another room are still distracting to them, even though they would be less distracting to us. That is, young children tend to be broad listeners. They take in information or sound from everything around them, whereas adults tend to be selective. Even when we're just trying to listen to everything, we usually tend to focus on one thing at a time. We might switch our attention from one to another if we're trying to get a sense of what's going on in the room as a whole. But our natural tendency is to be selective, to pay attention to one thing at a time. Children's natural tendency is to take everything in at once. They tend to listen broadly. And the ability to listen selectively takes a very long time to develop. Indeed, it is not until the teenage years where they start showing adult-like ability to attend selectively. So if you think of this as an analogy to the real world environment and to animal species, animals that are predators generally benefit from paying attention to one thing, to really focusing on that thing. Whereas animals like rabbits and mice that tend to be prey they need to listen to everything at once or to pay attention to the entire world. If they were paying attention to only one direction, that would be bad because a threat could come at them from someplace else. In that way, children are just very different from us. They're more like that broad listening to all areas of sound. So the world is full of stimuli that are competing for our attention. And we can only focus on so much at one time. So we as adults work on a process of selective attention. It's like a spotlight. It highlights whatever we choose to pay attention to in that moment. But children generally just don't work that way. So imagine the last time you went to a party with friends. You went out to a restaurant or a bar. There were probably sounds from the wait staff, clinking plates and glasses, moving around. There were sounds of people using silverware. There were other people talking from the next table. Maybe there was some background music. But if it wasn't too loud, then you probably could tune out a lot of those sounds and pay attention to just what your friend was saying. And attention is how we do this. Because our ability to attend to things is limited, we tend to be pretty picky about what we pay attention to, and we tend to ignore lots of other sounds. And in order to do something like listen to a friend, or like read a book, you have to at least partially tune out lots of other things in your environment. But there's a cost to doing that, in that if something important does show up someplace else, you might not notice it. Because you're tuning out lots of things, you may simply not notice what's going on in other parts of the room. Children, they simply don't focus. They pay attention more diffusely. This means that they're worse at paying attention to noise, but they're also more likely to notice things that happen in that noise, or to notice things that are happening from the other room. So in fact, children are better at paying attention, at picking up on things that we miss. So it's not that they're just bad in general at listening, for example. It's that they're using a different strategy of listening. They're trying to listen to everything. And that makes them less good at paying attention to any one thing, but better at noticing changes in the background, changes that we might ignore or might have missed. So studies have presented both adults and, say, 5-year-olds tasks where they were supposed to pay attention to one item. And then later they gave them a surprise memory task for not only the things that they were supposed to be paying attention to, but also at things that they'd been in the background. And the adults were better at remembering the things they were supposed to be paying attention to, but the children were better at paying attention to the things they were supposed to be ignoring. So children are likely to notice things coming from the wrong sounds because they're not filtering them out. And that means if there's music in the background or TV in the background, they're going to miss the thing you wanted them to pay attention to, but instead pick up the things that you'd wanted them to miss, or that you'd wanted them to ignore, or that you thought they were ignoring. And I bet if you think back, you've probably experienced situations like this, where you wonder how a child learned something that you didn't expect them to learn, things that were not said to them, but maybe happened in the other room. People talk all the time about how children seem to have a propensity for learning things like the cuss words that their spouse said in the other room when they dropped something, or when they were talking on the phone and the child wasn't supposed to be attending to that. And part of that is because they don't just pay attention to the one person talking to them. They're trying to pay attention to everything, even when we don't want them to. So finally, some of our findings suggest that not only do children have trouble understanding in speech that's moderately loud, and they get distracted by sounds even that are quiet if they're coming from places, that they can hear, but that children need even more levels of quiet if they're trying to learn new information as compared to just recognizing information they already know. So noise can interfere with the ability to learn, even in situations where children can both hear the sound and attend to the sound. That if there's some noise, that will make it harder for them to have the resources left over to store that information in memory in ways that allow them to retrieve it later. And this can be shown either in the short term or in the long term. So in some of our lab studies, we simply try and teach children a new word. So we show them something that we think they don't know, and we say the word for that thing multiple times. We'll say something like, this is a whatever. And at the same time, we'll have a little bit of noise in the background. Not much, just a little bit. And we find that the noise levels that children can learn in are lower than the noise levels that they can understand in. That is, they need for the background noise to be even less than for the understanding task that I talked about earlier. So in the short term, just a little bit of noise can make it harder for children to learn. And over the long term, that can have long-term effects on their ability, on their learning overall. So if you remember, I mentioned earlier that study about the school. Children in the same grade were assigned to different classrooms. Some were assigned to the side of the building that was near the train tracks, and some were assigned to classes on the other side of the building, opposite the tracks. And like I said, by the end of the year, their scores were most of a full grade lower. So a very noticeable difference in what they managed to learn over the year. So far, what I have been talking about suggests three different things. One, children have trouble hearing and understanding speech, even in levels of noise that aren't really a problem for us as adults. Second, even when the noise isn't so loud that it covers up the speech, it can still be distracting to young children. And three, even if they're able to listen and attend, noise can make it harder to learn new information. So why does any of this matter? Well, unlike children, we can do things to control our environment. So if we think that something is too loud, that the radio is too loud, or the TV is too loud and it's distracting, we go and we turn it off. But we're only going to turn off those other things if they bother us. And what we're seeing here is that young children can be affected by levels of noise that don't actually bother us necessarily. And we may not really think about that fact. So we may not think about the fact that we should be turning those sources of noise off. Now, I don't mean to imply that we have to avoid all noise, but rather that we should be making a point of thinking about how noisy it is and whether that level of noise in the environment is the right level of noise that children are going to be able to handle or not. And that we should be making a point of spending at least some of the time in the day talking to children without those sources of noise occurring at the same time, without the TV on or the radio on in the background, or with the door to the room closed so the sounds from outside aren't seeping in. So what are some things that you can do to help young children? One thing is simply to turn off sources of background noise, to be aware of noise in the environment and turn off the ones that you really don't need to have on. Another is to prioritize opportunities to talk to children in settings that aren't noisy. A second thing, or I guess it's really a third thing, turn off noise, prioritize talking in the times when it's quiet. But another thing is to let children see your face when you talk. Children, even really young children, even infants, naturally will pay attention to lip movements and use them to help them hear a noise. So if you face children when you talk to them so that they can see your face, that will help them deal with background noise. One of the ways we've actually shown this has been in comparisons across different groups of children. So many of you may know that children who have autism spectrum disorders tend to be less likely to watch faces. And indeed, one of the things that clinicians try and do is train them to watch faces because they tend not to naturally. One of the things we've seen is that those who watch faces tend to be better at listening in noise than those who don't, because the face is a useful cue. And looking at the face, not necessarily even the eyes, but just the mouth, can make it easier to hear speech and noise. So likewise, if we try and make a point of facing children when we're talking, instead of facing away from them and pointing at something, that will also help them learn from what we're saying and understand what we're saying. Another thing we can do is add rugs or to the floor or thick curtains to the wall. You may not be able to do that in all settings for other reasons, but thick carpet, thick curtains, thick wall hangings like Afghans or quilts that you might hang on the wall, they can absorb a lot of sound. They make a room noticeably quiet. In fact, even in my house, I recently hung something and I was surprised at how much quieter the room sounded just from that one thing. So putting things on the wall that are soft, that are absorbent, will help reduce noise sounds, both sounds from the outside, but also the sounds of children playing that would otherwise echo off the walls, that would bounce off the walls and make the room noisier. And finally, try to avoid all of those electronic toys that make lots of noise. Children will make lots of noise by themselves without any help because they're going to bang things together regardless of what you do. But you don't need to add to it by using the kinds of toys that have loud and distracting sounds playing all the time, like the bouncy seat, or also like the fake telephones that play all sorts of music. And that was all I'm going to say. I'm happy to answer any questions.
We have one comment that one program, Liz's program, is a battery-free center. So no nosy toys or equipment. I have not heard that phrase being used as one battery-free center. And I'm just pausing here, just letting everyone process what you just handed us, Rochelle. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And please feel free to participants who are listening right now to unmute and ask a question or write it in the chat. Oh, I have one question in the chat, it looks like. So do you have any toy suggestions for speech type toys? So we have a
I
phone
do
that their own.
actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead and read it.
I'm sorry. So we have a phone that their own voice echoes through, and I'd love more like those.
So actually, one of the ones that I like a lot, and I hate to be advertising right now, but for a while, Hallmark was putting out these books where you could record your voice. And for each page, as you flip the page, it would then play the words it would play your recording. So you could record you reading the story to your child or to a child. And then as they flipped the book, they would get the story as it went along with each page. And I really like those a lot. You can record them very slowly and very clearly. I think that they're great for grandparents actually, but also for anyone when they're not with their child, that their child can hear their voice. So it helps young children maintain relationships with family members who are away. But I think it also can help families as a child is transitioning to spending more time away from their parents to be able to hear their voice if they want to. Also, when children tend to like hearing the same story over and over. And so then this kind of feeds into that. It lets them learn the story and it matches to the pages. So I think those are really great. Trying to think about another one. Yeah, anything that you can record where the child can hear their voice or a known voice. And I will say that another thing that helps children is they tend to do better at listening in noise when the voice is familiar to them. So hearing their parents' voices, but also your voices is going to be more useful than hearing a pre-recorded external voice. So even if it's just you recording the same thing, that actually makes it easier for them to hear because your voice is one that they're familiar with, that they know, and that they will likely choose to listen to over and above other types of voices.
I
I
had a
also,
question for, oh, I'm sorry.
sorry,
I
I
don't
was
mean
going
to.
to say, there's also some companies that, this isn't a toy, but they make smoke alarms where you can record a voice, because often if there is a smoke alarm, the young children, and even school-age children will panic from that. Especially if they were woken from a nap or woken from sleep. But even in any environment, that kind of alarm can be very scary and can make children panic. And there have been a number of cases where, in response to an alarm, what the child did was go and run and hide in the closet, which was particularly not useful because not only did it not get them going outside away from the fire, but it also meant that nobody could find them to get them out. And so there have been some suggestions that actually having smoke alarms that instead of having an alarm just says, well, you could record your voice saying, everyone, please go get your coats and go to the door, or whatever it is that you would normally say to go outside for recess, for example, will be a much safer approach for young children because it would cause them to be less panicky and remind them what they're supposed to do.
I have a question for you that came up as I was listening to you, Dr. Newman. So would you say, is there a difference between noise that is the source of it is speech and language rather than something that's more musical in nature? Is there a difference between those in its effects?
There actually is. And it depends. There have been some studies done with adults. There's nothing we know of with kids, but there have been some studies with adults that suggest that because music is itself rewarding, that you tend to learn better in music than other types of background noise. And so that noise in general may be harmful, but music may actually be helpful in some settings. Now that's particularly for instrumental music, not for music that contains voice as part of it. And it's not clear what that means for young children. In fact, I've got a student who's studying that very thing right now, or looking to. So we don't really know, but there is some suggestion that music is certainly less bad for understanding through and learning through than speech is. Speech is absolutely worse. And in fact, speech of a single talker for young children is worse than many talker babble. Whereas for us, many talkers at the same time is much worse than just a single person in the other room talking on the phone. The reverse is the same case for children. Children actually do worse with just a single talker because they take in both and they can't selectively attend. If there's two single talkers, they're spending a lot of their cognitive resources processing both of them, and that actually ends up being more problematic for them.
All right, I have a follow-up question. So, has there been anything done to look at the difference again between different types of background noise? So, something that's from nature, like water running, or something that's more industrial, such as like a factory nearby or the train that you were referring to earlier.
Actually, no, there hasn't been. I know for people trying to fall asleep where you use one consistent noise as a noise maker with the intention that it will cover up other varying noises that might have been going on, that people sometimes argue about whether you should be better off with just a hissing sound versus something more natural, like the sound of water running. But in terms of it, when it's a little bit louder and it can interfere, there haven't been any studies that have looked to see whether it matters. For adults, what really seems to matter is whether it's overlapping in frequency range with the speech. So for example, birdsong and cricket chirps are really high pitched and they interfere less with speech than somebody else talking does. Because the birdsong and the crickets are just very high frequency. They're not kind of masking the parts of the signal that are most important for understanding what someone is saying. But again, children are different in that respect. And children are more bothered by those kinds of high frequency noise than adults are.
Okay, I have one more question. And again, for those who are listening in, I know it's nap time, but if you have questions, please bring them forward. Um, I was curious if you could just speak to, is there an impact on children exposed to background noise during sleep?
That's a good question. And again, it's not one we really know much about. We do know that their brain is still processing sounds during their sleep. So to some extent, they are, not that they can learn from that necessarily, I don't mean that, but that they are doing brain work. So it is presumably less restful, but there's been surprisingly little work on it. What we do know is that for children who heard something at one point in the day, if they're more likely to remember it 8 hours later if they slept intervening. So if they napped. for example, that allows our brain to process what we've already heard and store it for long-term memory. So sleep is an important time where your brain is doing important work, processing the things that you learned earlier so that you can maintain that knowledge. And that's really important for young children. So that sleep is really essential. But we don't know a lot about how noise interferes with that. We know for adults, noise can partially wake you, and that tends to result in people feeling less rested, and that tiredness makes all sorts of things worse, our emotional state worse, but also our ability to pay attention and to learn worse. But we don't really know as much about it for young children.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newman. This has been an amazing presentation, and we thank you so much for putting this together for us and sharing your knowledge with the impacts regarding the impacts of background noise on children.